Bueno, compañeras, compañeros, buenos días. Bueno, iniciamos
Very
la
well,
llamada
colleagues.
mientras
Good
se siguen
morning, and we're
conectando el
gonna
resto
start
de
this
participantes
call while we
que
wait
se han
for other
inscrito
colleagues to join.
y también, digamos, para
And
no alargar un poco el
to
tiempo
not
que Tove nos está brindando
extend
para
the
esta
time
llamada.
that Tove is giving us for
Eh,
this call.
Tove, ¿tú puedes oírnos?
Tove,
Tove,
are you able
can
to
you hear
hear
us?
us? Tove, can you hear us?
Yes? Okay, great. Bien,
Very well.
bueno, para empezar,
To
quería
start,
comentarles que
I wanted to tell you that
la idea del día de hoy era poder
the idea for today
actualizar un
was
poquito el
to
proceso que se viene llevando a cabo en Naciones
update
Unidas.
you on the process that
Hace
is going on
unos
in
meses
the
atrás tuvimos una
UN. A few
primera
months ago,
llamada
we
también
had
un
a
poco amplia
first call
para
that was a little
conversar
broader where
sobre cómo
we
estaba
talked
viniendo este
about
proceso, ¿no? Qué es lo que estaba
this
sucediendo
process, what was
en Naciones
happening
Unidas en este
in the
marco
United
de
Nations under the framework of
reestructuración del
the
sistema fiscal
restructuring
internacional,
of the
¿no?
international fiscal
Un
system.
proceso
This is a
que hemos venido
process
impulsando
that we
durante
have
muchos
been
años, casi
driving
una
for
década,
many years,
tratando
more than a
de
decade,
constituir un
trying
espacio
to build
eh, realmente inclusivo y participativo,
a
¿no?
truly inclusive
Que
and
pueda
participative
ayudar
space
también a
that
incorporar
can
los
help
principales desafíos que
incorporate
tienen nuestros países
the
en materia de
main
tributación
challenges that
y
our countries face in terms
la
of
lucha contra el fraude
taxation
fiscal,
and
contra la
the
evasión, la
fight
elusión,
against
pero aún
fiscal
más allá,
fraud,
¿no? Tratar de
evasion,
reestructurar o ver la forma de
eh,
cooperar conjuntamente
avoidance,
y de
but
una
to
u otra
restructure
manera
and see
también
how to
incorporar algunos
cooperate together
procedimientos
and
que podrían llevar
incorporate elements
a
that could
un mejor diseño del sistema
lead to
tributario, ¿no?
a better
Para
design
lograr
of
la
a taxation
progresividad
system, also to
y no así
achieve
encontrarnos con
progress
algunos
and
eh, eh, algunas
fight
herramientas también que se vienen
or
aplicando en
to
varios países,
we also
¿no?
have some tools that are
Como
being used in
la
some
baja de impuestos
countries,
por la
such as
cancelación de inversiones, ¿no?
lowering
Las
and
exoneraciones
taxes
fiscales sobre todo,
through
y,
investments
eh,
and
y sobre todo para tratar de
and
avanzar
to
en esta
try to
dirección, ¿no?
advance.
Como sabíamos o como sabemos,
As
ha
we
habido un
know,
proceso ya de
there's
hace
been a
cerca
process
de unos
that has
7, 8
taken
años atrás,
about
que ha
7 or 8 years,
también
or happened 7 or 8 years
la
ago.
OCDE a través del
This
marco
is a
inclusivo de
process
BEPS.
in the
Es un
OECD.
proceso también
This was
interesante desde la
an
creación, pero que no
interesting
ha
process
conllevado,
from its creation, but
digamos,
it didn't lead to,
cerrar las lagunas fiscales
well,
que
it didn't help close those
siguen
fiscal
incrementando incluso,
gaps
¿no?
that are
Por
actually
no terminar los
growing
flujos financieros ilícitos. Entonces,
when we talk
y que
about
también
fighting
no ha permitido,
illegal flows of
hasta donde
money.
hemos podido
And
verificar en
as
estos
far as
años,
we can
de que
see,
no ha habido una participación
there
inclusiva de
hasn't
nuestros
been
países para poder
inclusive participation of
diseñar
our
e incorporar
countries
los
in
principales
designing
desafíos que
and
conlleva este proceso.
incorporating
Entonces,
the challenges
desde el año
of this
pasado,
design process. Last year,
más por empuje del grupo africano, del
more
grupo de
through
países
the
de
African
África,
group,
se
a
logra
group of African
establecer
countries
o incorporar en el debate de Naciones Unidas la
in the
necesidad de
UN, they
trabajar
include the
en
need
la
of
reestructuración de un sistema
to
tributario
work on
internacional de
a
cooperación internacional
international
en pie y de
cooperation
igualdad para
taxation
todos los
system
países,
that
¿no? Es
creates
decir, que
equality for all
este,
countries.
esto es aceptado, digamos,
This
por los
has been
países, bueno,
accepted
previo
by,
digamos,
well,
algunas vetos
prior
que se
some
tuvo ahí por intereses
vetoes that
quizás también
existed
de
there
grandes potencias, pero finalmente se
by
logró
some big
establecer
powers. But in
este
the end, we
mecanismo,
were able to
como
establish
habíamos
this
también conversado en la primera reunión
mechanism
que
that had
tuvimos,
been
y a
mentioned
partir de
in
ahí,
the first meeting. And then
la
with
enmienda de
that,
Naciones Unidas que
we
trabaja
have the amendment
en un
in the
proyecto de
UN of
resolución
working on a
que de
project or
alguna manera
resolution
trate de incorporar los
to
principales
try to
desafíos que se han
incorporate or
expuesto
include
de
the
forma cruda, lo
main
que está sucediendo en el nivel
challenges,
internacional sobre
to have a
la
mapping
tributación
of what
internacional y
is
cómo mejorar
happening
este proceso,
internationally
como
on
habíamos
international
señalado, de
taxation and
igualdad de
how to
condiciones, ¿no?
improve
Ha sido un
this
proceso
process to create
intenso, grande,
equality of
que
conditions. This has been a long
finalmente
process that in
el
the end,
secretario
the
general de Naciones Unidas
General Secretary of the
presentó
UN
hacia fines de octubre hacia
introduced
fines de octubre de este año una propuesta
at the end of
de proyecto
October
de
of this
trabajo,
year a
una
proposal of
resolución
a
que, bueno, incluye
project
algunos
or
elementos,
a
¿no? Tres
resolution that
propuestas, tres
includes
opciones,
certain elements,
dos de
three
ellas vinculantes, una no,
options, two
y que de
binding,
alguna
one not
manera
binding.
también este
And
proceso es un proceso que
this
continúa,
process is
¿no?
a
Y
process
que
that
tiene
is
fin,
going to
digamos,
continue.
para
And
establecer cuál va a ser el mecanismo
the
de
purpose
trabajo
is
que
to
los países
establish the
van
working
a
mechanism
desarrollar
that the
durante todo
countries
este
will
tiempo, que
develop.
va a concluir hacia el 23
And this
de
should
noviembre, donde
be
se va a
finished
tener que
by the
tomar una decisión,
23rd of
y
November
donde el
when
grupo
a decision will
africano
be made, and where the African group
hace muy poco
very recently Sorry. The resolution was in September, sorry. The UN General Secretary was in September, and the African group proposed an amendment for the resolution, or proposed a new resolution that includes some aspects from options 1 and 2. And, well, the idea is to... Graciel? Oh, yes. We have a question from Graciel, but I'm sure we'll be able to answer these questions. I'm just here giving you a brief summary or introduction, but Tove is going to be in charge of expanding or telling us what is happening. As I was saying, the idea is to have a convention from the UN that has conditions of equality and is beneficial for our countries. This is an open process that's being debated, and after the introduction of the Nigerian resolution in representation of the African country, they're discussing elements about it. There are advances and there's also some setbacks. There are countries that support the proposal, there's countries that do not. And, well, the idea now, today, was to get an update on the process, to know what is happening, and also what we can do in civil society in this last part of the decisions, and how can we continue contributing towards this debate. For this, again, we have Tove Ryding's participation. She's responsible of fiscal justice advocacy policies from Eurodad, and also the taxation Justice Network of Europe. Tove has been working very hard with other colleagues on this process, very closely following what has been happening in the UN and how the countries have responded to the different proposals. Tove is also coordinator of the Global Taxation Group of the Global Alliance, together with the Mechanism for Development of Civil Society. So they're making great efforts in this process. And just very recently, she finished the meeting with the working group with certain...
Parece que se quedó sin conexión. Bueno, avancemos, Tove, avancemos. Ya me parece que Luis había como sintetizado un poco lo que quería decir, así que avancemos con tu exposición mientras él regresa.
Gracias. Super. Thank you. I'll do my best to speak slowly and send my warm thanks to the interpreters for helping me. My Spanish is definitely not at the level of being able to discuss international tax politics. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to do my best to share the knowledge that I have. But the first thing I want to say is that we've come this far because there has been a huge push for a long time by so many organizations around the world. I think the joint campaign for a UN tax convention has been a huge success, but it's definitely because we've had so many colleagues pushing for it, including in Latin America. And of course, on that issue, you are the experts, and we, I think, have benefited a lot from all the great work that you've already been doing. And in terms of where we are now, so indeed, as Louis said, there's a negotiation now at the UN under the second committee. And they are supposed to finish by the 22nd of November. And the reason we have a negotiation and the reason why they're discussing a UN tax convention is because the Africa group has put it on the table and demanded a UN tax convention. And this is very much the same as we saw last year. And last year, when they put this on the table, the result that we got was that they decided by consensus that there will be a UN intergovernmental tax process. There will be a UN negotiation on tax. The question is what it's going to produce and what it will be doing. So, of course, now the Africa group is trying to make the UN tax convention the thing that they will be discussing. Already last year, we saw the Latin American countries that are OECD members or want to be OECD members. So countries like Chile, like Colombia, I think Costa Rica also played a role at one point. We haven't seen Brazil, as far as we know. Brazil has been neutral, but very much Colombia, Chile, Mexico, Costa Rica. And they are not supporting a UN tax convention. And what this does is because Mexico is not a member of the group of 77, but the other countries are. And of course, the group of 77 is the group of over 130 developing countries that normally negotiates together. And because of the Latin American OECD country group, G77 has not been able to find a joint position on this issue, and that weakens them in the negotiation. And they're basically negotiating as Africa group and as individual countries. India is negotiating on its own. And of course, we've seen, and there you know more than I do, but we've seen the PTLAC try to negotiate as a group. We haven't seen much from PTLAC at the UN yet, but we know that they are trying to negotiate together. We also have a group such as CARICOM, which is the Caribbean islands, and they have in the past supported more UN work, so they might also come with a statement. We actually expect that they would support a UN tax convention, but it remains to be seen. But so because we haven't seen the group of 77 find consensus, it means that we have this scattered picture with different countries negotiating on their own. And of course, what would be fantastic is if the Latin American OECD countries would allow G77 to support a UN tax convention. That might not be possible before 22nd of November, but we should also bear in mind that this campaign doesn't stop on the 22nd of November. So I think the work that we put in now to try and move them forward, it's a good investment no matter what, because we know there will be a UN tax negotiation no matter what. And so I think it's important to look at this as a long-term campaign as well. And in terms of the arguments in the negotiations, indeed, we understand that the OECD, they're very scared of this process. Apparently, they have been calling governments from Paris, so the OECD Secretariat, they're calling OECD members and saying that this is an existential threat towards the OECD, that there's a danger towards the whole OECD as an institution. I think that's an overreaction. I don't see the OECD no longer existing if there is a UN tax convention. But it's clear that they are very, very pressured and trying really hard to make sure that the UN doesn't work on tax. What we are saying to OECD countries in Europe is to say, think what you want about the OECD rules, whether you like Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and if you like automatic information exchange, that's all fine. But don't think that you have a global agreement. It's not a global agreement. It will never be a global agreement. You will never see all countries of the world follow the same rules. So you will still have a very chaotic global tax system unless you try and negotiate a real global deal on tax, a peace deal to stop all these tax conflicts, stop all this chaos, stop countries making their own rules at home and so forth. So we're really trying to tell them that even multinational corporations complain that the global tax system is chaos. And of course, this hasn't stopped because we're still seeing OECD countries fight amongst themselves and not being able to agree even on implementing the OECD rules. So we're trying to tell them if there's something in the OECD that you like, you can bring that to the United Nations. And if you get agreement at the United Nations, then you actually have a global endorsement, which is a huge upgrade of your OECD rules. We don't think that the OECD countries will manage to get Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 agreed at the UN. But one reason we're saying that is because the OECD countries themselves are still fighting about Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And for example, the United States is not implementing Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And actually, the OECD negotiations are quite chaotic. But in theory, if there is something you like from the OECD, you could bring it to the UN and have a global agreement. And what we're also saying is, look, we're not asking you to decide on a huge new tax system in one go. What we're saying is do a framework convention. You set up the basic principles and objectives and institutions, including a conference of the parties, like we have on climate, a COP, which is a global meeting where all governments negotiate as equals, and they have meetings, for example, once a year. So if we get the COP, then you can continue to make decisions in the future. So you take a stepwise approach. So that also means that you don't have to agree on everything now. You just start to build up a global system on international tax issues is what we're saying. And of course, in the EU, they don't love this idea, but I think the thing that worked last year was to create so much confusion and discussion among the OECD countries that they didn't block progress. They don't have to love this, but as long as they are discussing internally, it's difficult for them to stop the Africa group, and it's difficult for them to block the negotiations. So that's what we're trying to do. And one of the things that has worked really well in some countries is to talk to the foreign ministries, because they normally lead on UN issues. So now that we have a UN tax process, it means that we have foreign ministries at the table. And that means that it's not only the finance ministry that decides on international tax issues. And we are seeing, of course, finance is still very powerful, but we are seeing discussions between the foreign and finance ministries, because the foreign ministries, they understand international relations. They're worried about how their relation to other countries are, and they're worried about blocking negotiations. And the other thing that they also understand is that we need finance for the Sustainable Development Goals. So those are some of the things that we're doing in other countries. And then I think a combination of doing work at the national and regional level has worked very well. And we also have some colleagues that contact the negotiators in New York and ask over email, can you tell me what you're doing? What is our country's position? What are you saying in the negotiations? And we also sometimes have Zoom calls with the government representatives, and we discuss the positions online. And that's actually worked quite well as an online advocacy method. This is quite new, but that has also worked quite well. And the last thing we're doing is, of course, we have a letter to governments with over 150 organizations that have signed. And so we're sending that tomorrow. Today is the last chance for signing. So we're trying on many different levels to work together to push for progress. I think it's looking all right at the moment, but it's very difficult to say whether the OECD countries will, at the end of the day, accept the Africa Group's proposal. All we know is that that was what happened last year. They said until the very last minute, we don't like this, we can't accept this. And then at the end of the day, even the United States surrendered and said yes to the Africa Group's proposal. So of course, we're hoping that they will do the same this year and that they will say yes to negotiating a UN tax convention. But we can't be sure. All we can do for now is to push as hard as we can and then see this as a long-term campaign. Even if everything goes perfect at the 22nd of November, it still means that we have a long way ahead of us. And even if everything goes wrong, it also still means that we can still come back and push for progress again. So I think we should see this as a campaign that step by step will move forward, but it's definitely not finished in a month. I think I'll hold there for now. I hope that was helpful, Louis and everybody. And thank you, Adrian, also. I'm happy to take any questions or comments there might be.
Thank you very much, Tove, for your summary. I know that many things has happened, but you have summarized it well. You have given us the key points of what has been happening in these negotiations. Thank you for giving us an update on what you're seeing in the UN and the role that certain OECD countries have, and also some regional spaces, which is what is happening in the LAC platform and the G77 and even CARICOM, what they're seeing in terms of how to advance. And of course, the role that the OECD and certain powers have to try to maintain the status quo, that what they have now, controlling the international architecture or system. I understand that negotiations go on, and I'm sure this will go on beyond the 22nd of November, but I understand that we have to have a position, or that the countries have a position, and they have to make a decision about how they're going to work and who's going to control or direct the destinies of the countries in taxation matters. So there have been some questions that were left pending, and there was one mentioned by Graciele at the beginning of the meeting. And this is connected to something that we wanted to know about. We wanted to know what was in the proposal from Africa, what would change, how would it improve the global taxation system, and what would be differentiation between the three options that the General Secretary had proposed. And well, basically, I don't know if you could talk to us about that, and then maybe later on we can open up the floor for more questions or comments from our colleagues.
Excellent. Yes, the details of the different proposals and options. Indeed, there was, maybe I start with the three options from the Secretary General's report. Option one is a full tax convention that has details about how do we tax corporations, what do we do about illicit flows. So basically a fully negotiated convention. Option 2 is the framework convention, where you set up the basic structure, objectives, principles, scope, which issues are covered and not, and the COP, the Conference of the Parties, that makes decisions in the future. And the framework convention then becomes a place where you negotiate more agreements later on. And one example of a framework convention is the UN Climate Convention. The proposal that we have for a UN tax convention is also a framework convention. So it has this stepwise approach. It can make more agreements later on, like the Kyoto Protocol was an agreement under the UN Framework Convention. The Paris Agreement was an agreement under the Framework Convention. And so that's option 2. And option 3, it's a bit confusing, but all that's clear about option 3 is that there's nothing legally binding. No matter what, nothing legally binding. It can be guidelines or different types of joint agreements, nothing binding. And it's quite unusual on tax. In fact, I don't know one single country that says we should not have legally binding tax agreements, because the OECD countries, they support legally binding conventions at the OECD, and they advocate very strongly for for example, the multilateral instrument for BEPS. That's a legally binding agreement. We have a new proposal for a Pillar 1 legally binding agreement just came out. So OECD countries want legally binding agreements, but they don't want it at the UN. And option 3 is to say the UN can never do anything legally binding, which is basically saying that they can't do anything meaningful on tax, in my view. The Africa Group's proposal, Africa Group has proposed option 1, so a comprehensive convention, but they also have some of option 2, because they also say there should be flexibility for the future. So that sounds like they're also saying more agreements in the future. So it's a very, very ambitious proposal that they have put on the table. And they're saying that this should be agreed by preferably June 2025. So less than 2 years. And it's not impossible. The climate convention was negotiated in 15 months, but it's a tight timeline, especially if you're looking at a very comprehensive convention. And then the Africa Group proposal says that tax should be linked to sustainable development, inequality, gender, environment. So it's the first time we see tax linked to other issues. If you look at the OECD, there's no mention of sustainable development and gender and inequality. But in the Africa Group proposal, there is. And the OECD now has some negotiations on tax and carbon and tax and climate. But otherwise, the OECD doesn't link tax to these other issues. So we're very happy about that. And the Africa Group proposal is also very strong on saying that civil society should be part of the process. And the last thing they say, and that's also very important, is that the process should be member state led. And this is quite normal at the UN, that the member states lead the negotiations. They make the proposals, they negotiate with each other. But what we have at the OECD is very secretariat-led. It's the secretariat that drafts the negotiating text. It's the secretariat that does the updated drafts. They do the proposals for agreements and so forth. So on tax, it would actually be a big change to go from a secretariat-driven process to a member state-driven process. And we think this would be good because it would mean that the countries have more ownership and influence. And one of the problems that we believe we see at the OECD is that the agreements don't get implemented because countries don't have ownership. I'll stop there for now. Great to see you, Veronica. Maybe I should hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Tove, for clearing that up and differentiating the different proposals and what the African proposal includes about how to structure the international taxation system. Very interesting and important. So now we're going to open the floor for questions. I see some things written in the chat, but I see that Veronica has raised her hand. So I give you the floor so that you can tell us, Veronica. Well, thank you very much. To clear this up, I still work for the Argentinian state, but I am no longer director of international fiscal matters. So about the options, option 3 makes me feel like it's more of the same. It would be in the end, if it's not legally binding, it's the same tax committee that we have now that makes decisions, but they're not legally binding, right? That's the sensation I get. And then I believe that what Tove was saying of going towards the chancellor's offices could be a good strategy to working with the ministries of foreign affairs. I believe that that could be useful to unlock, because I believe that, well, in my experience, I have the sensation that sometimes in the ministries of finance, they don't completely understand the international political roles. On the other hand, in the foreign affairs or chancellor's offices, the problem would be that sometimes they don't want to make decisions that are related to taxation matters because they're afraid of it, because these are topics that are not under their purview, and sometimes I think the decision is frozen because of that reason. So a good combination, working with chancellor's offices without leaving behind ministries of finance, including them in the decisions, but also mentioning that it is a political decision, not an economic decision or financial decision. And as I was saying, but closing the door could be a problem in the UN in the future. That's it. Thank you. Thank you, Veronica. Do we have any other questions or comments? Oh, okay. I see Jorge. I'm looking at the chat. I have Rocio. Well, okay, sorry. Natalie asked about why not defending proposal 1, and Rocio asks us to support the African proposal and why not with the General Secretary of the UN. This is the 2 questions from the chat, and maybe Tove, you can write those down so that you can round out or clear up what is happening. Okay, Jorge, you have the mic. Yes. A very warm hello to Tove. It is a pleasure to have her here with us. I wanted to ask you, Tove, on the 10th of this month, November, in Bogota, we're going to be holding an in-person meeting of the taxation platform of Latin America. We are going to be presenting as Latindadd, also the Fiscal Justice Network, and other organizations that we call the driving group of civil society in this process. So it's very important to know the nuances of the positions of some of the countries in Latin America, especially, I would say, Colombia, that has the pro-temperate presidency of this platform. So what is what is their game? What's Mexico and Chile's game? Because there is a pro-temperate presidency where you have both Colombia and Chile, to give you an idea. And we have read declarations from Chile and Mexico, and one joint declaration from both Mexico and Chile saying that we do sort of agree, but we are also not very convinced. So I would, if you could explain to us those nuances, because it will be very important for us who will be participating on the 10th of November on this conference, and we will be able to have 2 interventions in that platform. So we can maybe be able to have a positive position for the government about the positions. That's my concern. And thank you, Tove. Thank you, Jorge. And in that declaration of that joint position, I think it's Colombia. It was Chile, Mexico, and Colombia. Yes. Okay. I think I had Alejandro raising his hand, but he disappeared. Maybe we lost him. So let's move forward, Tove. Wait, I see Alejandro, sorry. Did you want to ask a question? Yes, yes. I think we can go to the answers and then we can go back to comments and joint actions and all that, and to share information about the country's positions. I think it's important, but I'm gonna hold my intervention for now. Okay, Alejandro, thank you. Tove?
Excellent. I will do my very best. It's a very good question. First, why are we not supporting option 1? Why are we not asking for the big thing? We kind of are. In our proposal for a UN convention, we wrote a framework convention, and this was before the Secretary General's report. But we have a framework convention that has quite a lot of substance. So it is a bit in between option 1 and option 2. But one of the reasons why we haven't suggested a full, very, very detailed convention is actually because when the UN negotiations start, we will probably learn a lot from developing countries discussing, building alliances, exploring what is source country taxation, how do you tax extractive industries. Usually we as civil society learn a lot, and therefore if we take, for example, a very detailed position on how should multinational corporations be taxed, what should the formula be for formulary apportionment, and all the detailed rules, it might actually be too early, because we might learn some things later on about ideas coming from countries. So that was why we didn't put too much detail in our proposal. We more said this should be negotiated and they should reach an agreement that is fair for developing countries. So and also the caution around option 1 is that should we try and say, let's get a very detailed convention, but it might take a long time? Or should we try and get a framework convention fast and then take step by step forward? And so there could be a strategy in saying, actually, we'd like to have a framework first and get something legally binding relatively soon, and then move forward. That said, we have just written a proposal to government, or a joint letter to governments where we are supporting the Africa group. And at the end of the day, I'm actually not sure that there is that much difference between option one, because you can have a framework convention with a lot of substance, or you can have an option one detailed convention that still has flexibility and making decisions in the future. So I'm not sure there's that much difference between option one and option two. We're supporting the Africa Group resolution, and then we'll see. But it sounds like the UN Secretariat are suggesting framework convention, so option two as the compromise. And I'm not sure that I think the Africa Group is also okay with that. So at the end of the day, I think the big discussion is, should we have something legally binding or at the UN or not? And in terms of what their positions are right now, as we understand it, there is indeed Chile, maybe Colombia sometimes. We're quite confused. But they seem to be suggesting the same as the other OECD countries, which is that we should have a lot of discussion about which types of options there could be for doing something. Let's spend, the EU has said, let's spend 2 years now discussing the options before we do anything. And so they're very clearly trying to slow down the process and turn the UN into a talk shop. And that's one thing, is that if the UN, if you have countries blocking, then the UN can become endless discussions, as we know. But the UN can also move fast. And so the UN will move fast when governments cooperate. But what we see the OECD countries doing is to try and block progress and create endless discussions. And as we understand it, the Chile, Colombia, PTLAC group might be part of that. And I completely agree with you, Veronica. Yes, it really is more of the same, because I mean, the tax has been discussed at the UN and the League of Nations for over 100 years. They spend 100 years discussing what could be done. It's time for action. And indeed, there's the usual talk about strengthening the UN Tax Committee and all sorts of things to try and avoid the issue of negotiating a UN tax convention. The briefing on 9th of November is really interesting, and I think there are several things we can do. One is that we are getting updates from the negotiations about which country said what. And so I think it's important to look at what has Colombia, Mexico, and Chile been saying in the negotiations. And that might be good to make sure that we get as much information about that as we can before that meeting, so that you can all see in the group exactly what have the countries been saying in the negotiations. The other thing is to keep a track of what they're saying in capital. And there, I think Latin America is actually one of the countries where you follow the governments very closely. And I think I'm only watching from the outside, but it really looks like you're doing a fantastic job in monitoring them. And we shouldn't be surprised if those pictures are two different pictures, because sometimes the negotiators will be more aggressive to try and take a strong stand and then compromise in the end. And so it could be that capital is being more reasonable than what's going on in the negotiations, but that's also where it's good to keep an eye on the negotiators and try to pressure them to be more constructive. But what I would suggest before the 9th of November is really that we try and map out as much as we know about what have they actually been doing in the negotiations. Or sorry, the 10th of November. Yeah, let's see what other What other questions were there? I think that was it.
Sí, creo, Tove, que has contestado todo.
Tove, I think you were able to
Mencionamos
answer everything
la
related to what Veronica
necesidad
was
de
saying
hablar
in
con los
terms of the
cancilleres,
need
los
to
cancilleres
connect
que
with
son
the
los que,
chancellor's
digamos,
offices
son los que toman
that
decisiones
are the ones that
en el
make
CID, ¿no?
decisions in the
Y
UN.
a veces hay
And
esa,
sometimes there's
digamos, disrupción entre
this
lo que quiere el
this
gobierno con el Ministerio de
disruption
Finanzas
between what the
y lo
governments
que la
want
Cancillería, por otro
and
lado, quiere
what the
y lo que se
ministries of
lleva, digamos,
finance want and what
a
the
Naciones
chancellor
Unidas. No sé
wants and what
si
they bring
también
to
algo
the
de eso
UN.
quieres comentar.
So maybe you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, very good, very good. Yes, the foreign ministries have been much better than the finance ministries in many countries. It's mainly in Europe that we've tried to talk to them. But for example, an argument like it's not good for Colombia, Chile, and Mexico. Well, Mexico is not in the group of 77, but for Colombia and Chile to be blocking the group of 77, that's quite controversial. And foreign ministries are very conscious of making sure that you have good relations to other countries. Finance ministries don't understand things like that as much. So the foreign ministries have been quite good when we raise issues about how it's important to be constructive internationally. And what we've also told the foreign ministries is that you guys are experts on global governance and on negotiations. It's not gone very well at the OECD. The OECD countries are fighting with each other. They're refusing to sign the agreements. This summer, we had Canada walk out of the negotiations, even though they're an OECD member state. The United States is walking away. And so this fact that the OECD rules, it's quite chaotic, the negotiations. And that's where we're telling the foreign ministries, you actually have a lot of expertise on how to negotiate global agreements and how to do global governance. We need your help on tax because the political situation is extremely unstable on tax. And the other thing that the foreign ministries know a lot about is, of course, sustainable development goals. So we're also trying to tell them it's extremely important for the financing for the sustainable development goals that the tax systems start to work. So you really have a strong interest on tax, and it's very important that you get involved. So that's what we've been trying to tell them. We're not saying that finance ministries shouldn't work on tax, but what we've seen, for example, in the climate negotiations, is that many ministries are involved. Environment, foreign ministries, prime minister's office. So they can actually have national delegations where they have more ministries. And that's what you see at the UN. Whereas at the OECD, it's most often it's only finance ministries. And so we think it would be better if the ministries started working together.
Genial, gracias, Tove, ¿no? Y por ahí en el chat, claro, sale
Great, thank you,
también
Toby.
las
And
consultas,
in the
bueno, claro, de
chat,
esa
we can see the
articulación, ¿no? La
consultations
necesidad de avanzar
and the need to advance,
de dialogar, digamos, con los
well, to
representantes en Naciones Unidas,
discuss with the
de las
representatives of the
cancillerías, ¿no?
Union and the
De
representative of
las
the
relaciones exteriores,
chancellors
¿no?
or
De alguna
ministries
u otra
of
manera hemos ido haciendo,
foreign
levantando algo de
affairs.
información,
So
¿no?
we have
Pero la idea
been
es seguir
getting some
manteniendo ese
information,
diálogo,
but
¿no?
the idea is to
Que es muy
keep the
importante.
dialogue open.
Ahora,
Now,
bueno, bueno, en el chat está viendo un poquito
in
el chat y
chat, I've
justamente
been
la
looking at the
necesidad de
chat.
dialogar con
Yes,
las cancillerías.
the need to talk to the chancellor's offices.
Y
and
hay una, bueno, deseo la palabra a Graciela.
let's go with Graciel, and then we'll continue with whatever's in the chat. Graciel, go ahead. Thank you, Luis, and thank you, Tove, for the information. I would like to ask you one thing. There is a letter that has been signed, and I think that is going to be sent to the countries today or tomorrow. I would like to know the plans and how we can coordinate in the group so that we can send it jointly. What would be the strategy with that letter? And the other one, I would like to ask my colleagues from Brazil, Nathalie and Regina, when we talk about the G77, Brazil is normally known for their diplomatic capabilities, their ability to dialogue. Given that there is no specific position right now, could a strategy be to ask for Brazil's support in the G77 to reach a position? That's it. Thank you. Thank you, Graciela. And we also have Alejandro. Alejandro raised his hand. Go ahead. Thank you very much, Luis, and thank you very much, Tove, for all the valuable information. And thank you. I'd like to thank Latindadd for the space. I wanted to comment on the stakeholders within the government that where we should direct our advocacy. I think the missions and the ministries of finance and foreign affairs or chancellor's offices, especially for the OECD countries in Latin America. I think also the ambassadors for the OECD for these countries. It's also important to consider them because in these discussions about the positions of Mexico, Colombia, and Chile, what we have understood or the information that we have received is that the missions in New York are not just consulting the ministries of finance and ministries of foreign affairs, but they also hold dialogues with these ambassadors, or are the ambassadors having active contact? They're looking for delegations to influence their decisions. We know that Chile we know this from Chile. In the same time, they are supporting the African delegation, but they also influencing their ambassador colleagues from the countries of the OECD in Latin America. So this is to consider them in the strategies and actions at country level to map these key stakeholders to share the actions that we have for the actions that we have from IGRI for that problem specifically, by request of one of the countries about this problem with the ambassadors. We are going to ask for meetings for some of those commissioners with these ambassadors. I think it's important for them to understand the process in the UN, as Tove mentioned it. And if there's something that they like from the OECD, how to integrate that into the UN negotiations and make them understand how this UN process is a process that will have global legitimacy and will be able to be implemented given the content of the African resolution. And also, so this is the comment that I wanted to make about the position of these countries. Thank you, Alejandro. Is there any other questions? There's a discussion and exchange of ideas in the chat. So thank you, Sergio, for the information of the policy tracker. And it's important to follow up on the positions and the financing mechanism, and the civil society negotiations also have a tool for tracking. It would be good to know about the TJN, to know a little bit more about what is being done and the role of each one of the countries regarding the negotiations that are being carried out. And Natalie tells us that she spoke with the Ministry of Treasury in Brazil, but they haven't taken a decision. They're being neutral in terms of the UN. So the important thing there is to send the letter. Okay. And to position what they say. Well, it's a position, meaning we don't understand why Lula is not acting towards an inclusive convention, but it's a pragmatic role as far as we understand it. Sergio, you raised your hand. Go ahead. Yes, thank you very much, Luis. And I'd like to thank the network, and I'd like to thank Tove for this, for telling us where the discussion is at. As I understand it, even though there is significant work to be done with several developing countries that may be having an ambivalent position, in any case, it seems like the priority work right now would be with those who are blocking, that are mostly the European Union and US. So maybe as a complement to the letter that will be sent to the delegation, maybe we should have a letter from the organizations of countries from the global south. I'm thinking about the organizations that are part of the Initiative for Human Rights and Fiscal Policies, and other organizations dedicated to human rights that go beyond the region, where they are calling the states to adopt positions regarding their obligations in terms of human rights, and obligations that have an extraterritorial dimension, that lead to special considerations in how they can affect the possibilities of other states to be able to use resources to guarantee rights. A letter of that nature, that could be organizations from Latin America and other regions, that could go to the countries and delegations, countries and the delegations of countries that are blocking. Could this be a complement to the letter that many of the organizations here would sign, and for the mechanism of coordination? Thank you, Sergio. Tove, we go with you.
Super. To the last question, whether there could be additional value in Global South letters or LAC letters, your initiatives, yay, I think that would be fantastic. And very much up to you to decide what works in your countries and regions, because we can only do so much with the global letter that is general to all countries. But maybe if you do a letter just in Latin America, you can target it more to what the discussion is, and also the political context in your region and countries. So it sounds very good to me. And we have done, indeed, we have done some tools. We're sending out now the final version of the Q&A, question and answers. So we have 47 different questions and answers with all the basic facts about where's the UN process at, what's going on at the OECD, why do we need a UN tax convention. And so it's a tool that is designed to help and support the work at the national and regional level. And you can find in there also links to more information. And so we've tried to share all the information that we have about how the UN works and so forth. Brazil, this is my own impression, but yeah, I've been following UN processes for 20 years. I know Brazil as one of the absolute strongest countries in the negotiations. The Brazilian negotiators are really competent, very strong. And indeed, we have heard the same, that Brazil is being neutral. We had also hoped that with Lula back, maybe there could be a more progressive position from Brazil. But we haven't seen that so far. But it's true that usually Brazil is very loyal to G77 positions and very good at challenging the OECD countries. But I also understand there is a negotiation about membership of the OECD going on, and they're chair of the G20, and yeah, so I can understand that it's complex. But my impression is that working on trying to see if Brazil can move could be very important, because Brazil is so strong. The plan for the letter, indeed, we have over 150 organizations that have signed the letter to governments. And the plan that we have is to send the letter to the UN negotiators tomorrow. But then it's up to the national and regional organizations whether they and how they want to send it to foreign affairs or finance ministries from the national level. So we're encouraging everyone to send the letter and perhaps ask for meetings. But of course, you already have meetings in Latin America. So really up to you to decide what would be helpful. I can't know the details of that. Yes, we've heard that the Latin American OECD members, including Colombia, has been trying to influence the Africa group a lot. This is just gossip, but what we have heard back is that the Africa group doesn't trust them. Colombia, of course, Jose Antonio Campo was ambitious, but then came another signal, and Colombia has been very back and forth. And the negotiator in New York, they say, has not been very helpful. So what we have understood is that the Africa group has been trying to not let themselves be influenced. And Colombia, I think, at one point wanted to help the Africa group draft the resolution. And I believe the Africa group said no thanks, and they wrote their own. So this is just rumors, but as I understand it, the Africans don't trust the Colombians. And what Colombia has said, and we hear the same from many Europeans, and also from Norway and Switzerland and others, is that they want to be bridge builders. They want to build a bridge between the OECD and the Africa group. But that's where we're saying, look, a negotiation is about building bridges. If you say no to negotiating a UN tax convention, you can't say that you are in favor of building bridges, because you're actually refusing to negotiate. Africa Group has suggested, let's do a peace deal on tax. Let's sit down and agree on the global tax framework. If you're saying no to that, then you're refusing to negotiate, you're refusing to cooperate, you are not a bridge builder, is what we're saying. And the last thing that we're trying to push in Europe is the fact that Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 has been a huge disappointment. The Pillar 2 rules were changed in the last minute. They introduced a special rule that's called the qualified domestic top-up tax. But the fact is that Pillar 2 is going to get much less money to most countries than what we thought. For example, in Scandinavia, in Denmark, Finland, Sweden, the countries get much less from Pillar 2 than they thought. And Pillar 1 looks like it's not going to happen, because the deal can't enter into force unless the United States signs. And the United States says it's not going to sign. So pillar one looks dead. Pillar two gives much less money than everyone had expected. And so we're trying to use that in Europe to go to finance ministries and say, don't you want more? This looks really disappointing. This is very little money that you expect to get from pillar two. Don't tell me you're happy now, because it seems there's a lot more that can be done to tackle tax havens. There's a lot more money that we can get in addressing illicit financial flows. So, and there's not going to be a BEPS 3. There's not going to be a new OECD negotiation on corporate tax. The only place that there is a negotiation going on now is at the UN. You have a strong interest. You can get more money for your country if you engage in a negotiation that the Africa Group is suggesting. So, and for finance ministries, of course, we know that money is always an important argument, but actually the OECD deal is so bad that we're trying to use this to explain to them that you have an interest in having a UN negotiation to get more. I think that's it for me. I hope I answered most of the questions.
Thank you very much, Tove. Very clear answers about what you're seeing and what is being negotiated and what's behind the negotiations and what we can do. A very good proposal on Sergio on creating a document from the region to send. I think that the letter has many key essential elements to bring our position as civil society organizations in the different countries. Well, we also see in the chat the link for those of you who were not able to read it. And Regina was asking about the Q&A document. We have it there in the chat too. If you didn't see it, I will copy it again and paste it there in a couple of minutes. But now we are running out of time for today's meeting. I don't know if there's any last questions before we close. Okay, I see Alejandro. Alejandro, you have raised your hand. Go ahead, Alejandro. Yes, this is related to what Jorge mentioned. The meeting the platform has next week, one of the ideas that we have is to have this be a decision-making space for these scenarios. I don't know if it would be a good action or if it would be redundant to have a communique the day of this platform meeting, calling on the countries in the platform to reach a position that is aligned with the African Alliance. This is an advocacy action that can provide visibility to the platform, and get the positions of civil society that it can be signed by the communique could be signed by the civil society organizations that are interested. I don't know. This is an idea, or do you consider it redundant with the other letters, or would this be a good action? Thank you. Thank you, Alejandro. Yes, I mean, that could be interesting to try to build a document in the meeting for the platform, providing a position from the group of organizations that are working on it, and also to share this with other organizations that could do advocacy with the different ministries of finance. Well, I think that's an excellent contribution and a good idea. We can talk about it, Alejandro. Very well. Is there anything else? Anything additional? I was trying to read what was written in the chat. Regina there mentions the not so neutral position. And it's a matter of talking about that. And how to do some advocacy to close or to create a clearer position. So we have Regina's comment there, and Rodolfo tells us that Mexico's role is key for 2025. And, well, I don't know if I missed anything, but I think we've been able to answer all the questions and we've been able to share the information. So if there are no further questions or comments, I'd just like to add that, as Tove says, this is still an open discussion. In the short term, we have the role of having advocacy with our governments and negotiators, the ministries of finance, and this opportunity of the taxation platform meeting that will have a panel on how to advance in the positions for the Convention of the UN. This will be a specific moment where we will be able to participate and transmit this to the governments that will be participating. It's not all the governments, it's 8 or 9. And to move the debate, the dialogue forward and refine our position. So in next steps, we have a need to do work with the ministries of finance and the chancellor's offices. Important discussions, as Alejandro said, with the representatives or ambassadors of these countries to the OECD. That's also interesting, given the roles that they have in the negotiations. So I think there's a short-term work that is important that we can continue working on. Maybe we haven't addressed many things today, but Tove has done excellent work in this Q&A document so that we can understand the UN process a little better, how it's been built, the elements behind it, the position of the OECD, and the position of other organizations, and the current debate. This is a document that had been developed at the beginning, at the first quarter of the year. It was an initial document, and this one is updated with the current dialogues, and it will be interesting to read. We have shared this in the chat so that you can find out what is happening in the process. Very well, that's it. This is what we wanted to share with you today, to try to talk to you about the advances and what's behind the negotiations and what work is to be done, and also to be able to develop the positions in these dialogues. Natalie? Yes, I have a question. The Q&A document can be used in the countries, or is it public or not yet?
Sí. Tove. Sí.
Tove.
We have a version where we have structured it a bit more and made it look a bit more nice. So that version will be public. So there is a public version coming out tomorrow, I think. And you're very welcome to use that with governments, definitely. So it's not public yet, but it's coming.
But it's coming in Word, so we can translate it to Portuguese, for instance, or it's going to be a PDF?
The online version will be PDF, but there's absolutely no problem in me sending the Word version, and translating it would be super. You can see whether everything should be translated or you just want to take the most important, but very happy to share it in Word as well.
Okay, so I'll ask Lucho
Gracias. Gracias, Natalie. Gracias, Tove. Disculpa, Tove.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Tove. And I'm sorry, Tove. I'm one day ahead of the official launch, but I'm sure tomorrow, with the new version, we will be able to use it broadly.
Okay.
It's almost the same. So all good, but the public version is coming tomorrow, yeah.
De acuerdo. Perfecto. Si no hay más,
Perfect. If there,
algunas cosas más por el
we see
chat,
some things being shared on the chat.
Bueno, no,
Oh, okay.
bueno, creo que ya está.
I think we're set. Sorry, Alejandro here is asking for the list of emails to share information. Alejandro, do you mean the information? Alejandro, right? Alejandro, you're asking about the information regarding these documents that we just mentioned? Yes, relevant information. For example, if anyone knows about something important and that would be interesting to other countries. For example, communications about intelligence that can allow the organizations of each country to direct their advocacy. No, we don't have a specific group to share information about what you're asking. I know that, okay, there's an important global space, and this is the space led by Tove with the global group. And this is on the taxation convention. I understand that this is a more or less open space so that you can participate, share intelligence, share information regarding this. So I understand that this, Alejandro, if you're there, this could be an interesting space. In fact, several colleagues have participated from Latin America. And you wanted to say something, Adrian? No, it's the same thing you were saying, Lucho, about that group. Also, in Latindadd, there are spaces where we get information and you can disseminate it to distribute it to the other organizations. Okay, so we're at the end of our meeting. Thank you very much, Tove, for the time that you have dedicated to update us on international dialogue and the impact for our region. I'd like to thank each one of you for the time that you have dedicated to this meeting. And we'll continue sharing information. We will continue pushing forward the process. I think everyone knows each other here, so this is an excellent space to continue talking about what is happening. So it has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Hasta luego, gracias.